pass a massive tax cut for the wealthy and the well-off, paid for by working families and middle-class folks all across the country, didn't do anything for middle-class Americans, didn't do anything to stimulate the economy. This whole notion of trickle-down economics. Come to the conclusion that trickle-down economics simply means that middle-class families, that working-class Americans may get a trickle, but they're guaranteed to stay down. That's what your economics are all about. Massive tax cuts for the wealthy and the well-off under President Reagan continued into President Bush. Bill Clinton comes to office, inherits a significant deficit, and under his stewardship, President Clinton turns a deficit into a surplus and passes that surplus to President George W. Bush, the so-called party of fiscal responsibility. And once again, we see the same exact playbook. Republicans inherit a surplus, and they immediately blow it to pass massive tax cuts for the wealthy, the well-off, and the well-connected, not provide relief to working class Americans. A tax cut in 2001, unpaid for, and then a tax cut in 2003, unpaid for. And then continue to run up the debt and the deficit, prosecuting two failed wars. The so-called party of fiscal responsibility want to lecture America when your record speaks for itself. President Obama comes in after mismanagement related to the prior administration, including helping to trigger the Great Recession, inherits a deficit from a Republican president of $1.5 trillion, as well as the Great Recession. And working under the leadership of President Obama, Democrats in the House and the Senate get the situation turned around, and over an 8-year period of time, reduce the deficit by $1 trillion, from 1.5 trillion to 500 billion. Progress under Democratic leadership as it relates to getting America's fiscal house in order. And then Donald Trump comes to office and again follows the same exact playbook. After failing to take health care away from millions of Americans, the Republicans turned their attention to the GOP tax scam, where 83% of the benefits went to the wealthiest 1%. Why? To subsidize the lifestyles of the rich and shameless. And in the process of doing that, borrow $2.3 trillion added to our debt. Explode the deficit, so-called party of fiscal responsibility. In fact, this debt that we're dealing with, that Democrats are taking seriously, that Republicans have no interest in being responsible around, that's what this 2-year suspension of the debt ceiling is all about. In our nation's 248-year history, 25% of our nation's debt was accumulated during the 4 years of the former president. 25%. How dare you lecture America about fiscal responsibility, ever? And then President Biden comes to office, gets big things done for the American people on infrastructure, on the CHIPS and Science Act, standing up a clean energy economy, rescuing America from a once-in-a-century pandemic, gets all of these big things done, partnering with House Democrats and Senate Democrats. and in the process, in its first 2 years, reduces the deficit by $1.7 trillion. And so we see a very clear pattern. The facts speak for themselves. Democrats are the party of getting things done and fiscal responsibility. Republicans are the party of massive tax cuts for the wealthy, the well-off, and the well-connected, which bring us to this very moment. Because this bill is designed to set up the GOP tax scam 2.0. To stick the American people with a bill so you can continue to cut taxes for wealthy donors and well-connected corporations and jam working-class Americans. That's what this bill today fundamentally is all about. That's why Republicans are suspending the debt ceiling for 2 years, the so-called party of fiscal responsibility. And in addition to these massive tax cuts, we know how you want to pay for it. Many Republicans have said this in the public domain, that we're going to end Social Security as we know it, end Medicare as we know it, end Medicaid as we know it, end nutritional assistance as we know it, not support our veterans. These are all the reasons why Democrats are opposed to this legislation. Because you're trying to jam working class Americans again, as you have repeatedly done over and over and over again. Those are the facts. The other problem with this bill is that we negotiated in a bipartisan, bicameral way, real progress for working class Americans, for middle class Americans, for everyday Americans who aspire to be part of the middle class. That has been cut out of this legislation. Why would you do that? Why would you eliminate funding for community health centers? That impacts the heartland of America, urban America, rural America, suburban America, small town America, Appalachia. Why would you cut out funding for community health centers? We're fighting for those everyday Americans. That's why we're opposed to this legislation. Why would you cut funding for nutritional assistance for children in America, for seniors in America, for veterans in America? Why would you do that? This bill cuts funding for nutritional assistance that had previously been agreed upon, and that's why we're opposed to this legislation. This legislation actually cuts a program that was designed to help children and their parents detect cancer. Cruelty is the point. Why would you eliminate that program? We're going to fight for the children of America.